After 4 years in Geneva, Sabina settled in Paris, but she could not escape her melancholy. If someone had asked her what had come over her, she would have been hard pressed to find words for it. When we want to give expression to a dramatic situation in our lives, we tend to use metaphors of heaviness. We say that something has become a great burden to us. We either bear the burden or fail and go down with it. We struggle with it, win or lose. And Sabina, what had come over her? Nothing. She had left a man because she felt like leaving him. Had he persecuted her? Had he tried to take revenge on her? No. Her drama was a drama not of heaviness but of lightness. What fell to her lot was not the burden but the unbearable lightness of being. Until that time, her betrayals had filled her with excitement and joy because they opened up new paths to new adventures of betrayals. But what if the paths come to an end? One could betray one's parents, husband, country, love. But when parents, husband, country, and love were gone, what was left to betray? Sabina felt emptiness all around her. What if that emptiness was the goal of all her betrayals? Naturally, she had not realized it until now. How could she have? The goals we pursue are always veiled. A girl who longs for marriage longs for something she knows nothing about. The boy who hankers after fame has no idea what fame is. The thing that gives our every move its meaning is always totally unknown to us. Sabina was unaware of the goal that lay behind her longing to betray, the unbearable lightness of being. Was that the goal? Her departure from Geneva brought her considerably closer to it. 3 years after moving to Paris, she received a letter from Prague. It was from Tomasz's son. Somehow or other, he had found out about her and got hold of her address, and now he was writing to her as his father's closest friend. He informed her of the deaths of Tomasz and Teresa. For the past few years, they had been living in a village where Tomasz was employed as a driver at a collective farm. From time to time, they would drive over to the next town and spend the night in a cheap hotel. The road there wound through some hills, and their pickup had crashed and hurtled down a steep incline. Their bodies had been crushed to a pulp. The police determined later that the brakes were in disastrous condition. She could not get over the news. The last link to her past had been broken. According to her old habit, she decided to calm herself by taking a walk in the cemetery. The Montparnasse cemetery was the closest. It was all tiny houses, miniature chapels over each grave. Sabina could not understand why the dead want to have the imitation palaces built over them. The cemetery vanity transmogrified into stone. Instead of growing more sensible in death, the inhabitants of the cemetery were sillier than they had been in life. Their monuments were meant to display how important they were. There were no fathers, brothers, sons, or grandmothers buried there, only public figures, the bearers of titles, degrees, and honors. Even the postal clerk celebrated his chosen profession, his social significance, his dignity. Walking along a row of graves, she noticed people gathering for a burial. The funeral director had an armful of flowers and was giving one to each mourner. He handed one to Sabina as well. She joined the group. They made a detour past many monuments before they came to the grave free for the moment of its heavy gravestone. She leaned over the hole. It was extremely deep. She dropped in the flower. It sailed down to the coffin in graceful somersaults. In Bohemia, the graves were not so deep. In Paris, the graves were deeper, just as the buildings were taller. Her eyes fell on the stone which lay next to the grave. It chilled her, and she hurried home. She thought about that stone all day. Why had it horrified her so? She answered herself, When graves are covered with stones, the dead can no longer get out. But the dead can't get out anyway. What difference does it make whether they're covered with soil or stones? The difference is that if a grave is covered with a stone, it means we don't want the deceased to come back. The heavy stone tells the deceased, stay where you are. That made Sabina think about her father's grave. There was soil above his grave with flowers growing out of it and a maple tree reaching down to it, and the roots and flowers offered his corpse a path out of the grave. If her father had been covered with a stone, she would never have been able to communicate with him after he died, and hear his voice in the trees pardoning her. What was it like in the cemetery where Teresa and Tomasz were buried? Once more, she started thinking about them. From time to time, they would drive over to the next town and spend the night in a cheap hotel. That passage in the letter had caught her eye. It meant they were happy, and again she pictured Tomasz as if he were one of her paintings. Don Juan in the foreground, a spacious stage set by a naive painter, and through a crack in the set, Tristan. He died as Tristan, not as Don Juan. Sabina's parents had died in the same week, Tomasz and Teresa in the same second. Suddenly she missed Franz terribly. When she told him about her cemetery walks, he gave a shiver of disgust and called cemeteries bone and stone dumps. A gulf of misunderstanding had immediately opened between them. Not until that day at the Montparnasse cemetery did she see what he meant. She was sorry to have been so impatient with him. Perhaps if they had stayed together longer, Sabina and Franz would have begun to understand the words they used. Gradually, timorously, their vocabularies would have come together like bashful lovers, and the music of one would have begun to intersect with the music of the other. But it was too late now. Yes, it was too late, and Sabina knew she would leave Paris, move on, and on again, because were she to die here, they would cover her up with a stone, and in the mind of a woman for whom no place is home, the thought of an end to all flight is unbearable. 11. All Franz's friends knew about Marie Claude. They all knew about the girl with the oversized glasses, but no one knew about Sabina. Franz was wrong when he thought his wife had told her friends about her. Sabina was a beautiful woman, and Marie Claude did not want people going about comparing their faces. Because Franz was so afraid of being found out, he had never asked for any of Sabina's paintings or drawings or even a snapshot of her. As a result, she disappeared from his life without a trace. There was not a scrap of tangible evidence to show that he had spent the most wonderful year of his life with her, which only increased his desire to remain faithful to her. Sometimes when they were alone in his flat together, the girl would lift her eyes from a book, throw him an inquiring glance, and say, "What are you thinking about?" Sitting in his armchair, staring up at the ceiling, Franz always found some plausible response, but in fact he was thinking of Sabina. Whenever he published an article in a scholarly journal, the girl was the first to read it and discuss it with him. But all he could think of was what Sabina would have said about it. Everything he did for Sabina, the way Sabina would have liked to see it done. It was a perfectly innocent form of infidelity, and one eminently suited to Franz, who would never have done his bespectacled student mistress any harm. He nourished the cult of Sabina more as religion than as love. Indeed, according to the geology of that religion, it was Sabina who had sent him the girl. Between his earthly love and his unearthly love, therefore, there was a perfect peace. And if unearthly love must, for theological reasons, contain a strong dose of the inexplicable and incomprehensible, We have only to recall the dictionary of misunderstood words and the long lexicon of misunderstandings. His earthly love rested on true understanding. The student mistress was much younger than Sabina, and the musical composition of her life had scarcely been outlined. She was grateful to Franz for the motifs he gave to her to insert. France's Grand March was now her creed as well. Music was now her Dionysian intoxication. They often went dancing together. They lived in truth, and nothing they did was secret. They sought out the company of friends, colleagues, students, and strangers and enjoyed sitting, drinking, and chatting with them. They took frequent excursions to the Alps. Franz would bend over, the girl hopped onto his back, and off he ran through the meadows, declaiming at the top of his voice a long German poem his mother had taught him as a child. The girl laughed with glee, admiring his legs, shoulders, and lungs as she clasped his neck. The only thing she could not quite fathom was the curious sympathy he had for the countries occupied by the Russian Empire. On the anniversary of the invasion, they attended a memorial meeting organized by a Czech group in Geneva. The room was nearly empty. The speaker had artificially waved gray hair. He read out a long speech that bored even the few enthusiasts who had come to hear it. His French was grammatically correct but heavily accented. From time to time, to stress a point, he would raise his index finger as if threatening the audience. The girl with the glasses could barely suppress her yawns, while Franz smiled blissfully at her side. The longer he looked at the pleasing gray-haired man with the admirable index finger, the more he saw him as a secret messenger, an angelic intermediary between him and his goddess. He closed his eyes and dreamed. He closed his eyes as he had closed them on Sabina's body in 15 European hotels and one in America.